Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to this presentation on the canonical marriage and the antinomies of contemporary commitment. Over the past several decades, the decline of sacramental marriage among young Catholics has become increasingly visible in many parts of the Church. Fewer young adults marry sacramentally, many postpone marriage for long periods, and others prefer relationships that remain provisional or informal. At the same time, many young couples continue to value love, fidelity, emotional support, and even lifelong partnership. The situation is therefore more complex than a simple rejection of marriage or of church teaching. From a canonical perspective, this distinction is important. The present difficulty cannot be explained adequately only in terms of moral decline, secularization, or doctrinal dissent. In many cases, marriage still appears desirable in principle. What increasingly appears difficult is definitive commitment itself, especially when commitment takes on a permanent, public, and ecclesial form. Canon law approaches marriage not simply as a relationship of emotional closeness, but as a juridic act through which a man and a woman establish a lasting communion of life. Matrimonial consent presupposes a form of freedom capable of making a stable and irrevocable commitment. Yet many contemporary patterns of formation encourage a different understanding of freedom, one more closely connected to reversibility, personal autonomy, and the preservation of future possibilities. For this reason, my study proposes the notion of antinomy as a more precise way of describing the current tension surrounding marriage. The issue is not merely tradition versus modernity, nor simply doctrine versus culture. Rather, the tension emerges between two different ways of understanding commitment, permanence, and freedom. The argument proposed in this presentation is therefore not that the Church's understanding of marriage has become incoherent or excessively demanding, nor is it that young couples are incapable of genuine commitment. Rather, the central issue concerns the growing distance between the canonical understanding of marriage and the formative conditions through which many young couples today learn to understand freedom, permanence, and personal responsibility. The contrast between canonical rigidity and modern culture appears frequently in contemporary discussions about marriage in the Church. According to this way of speaking, the Church is often portrayed as defending fixed juridic norms, while contemporary society is presented as emphasizing flexibility, personal autonomy, and evolving forms of relationships. Yet the magisterial and jurisprudential sources examined in this study suggest that this opposition is ultimately inadequate, especially from a canonical perspective. The present difficulty surrounding sacramental marriage cannot be explained simply as a conflict between old norms and modern life, nor can it be reduced to a straightforward rejection of Catholic doctrine. In fact, many young couples continue to value love, fidelity, emotional support, and a lifelong partnership. The difficulty arises elsewhere. It concerns the way commitment itself is understood. For this reason, the present study adopts the notion of antinomy as an analytic category. The term is useful because it allows us to describe the present tension with greater precision. In its classical sense, an antinomy does not describe a contradiction between truth and error. Rather, it refers to a tension between two coherent ways of understanding reality that come into friction when brought into contact with one another. Applied to marriage, the antinomy does not arise between doctrine and lived experience in a simplistic sense, not between canon law and personal sincerity. Instead, it emerges between two understandings of freedom, commitment, and permanence. On the one hand stands the canonical and theological understanding of marriage. Marriage is understood as a definitive vocation, established through an irrevocable act of consent. Matrimonial consent is not simply the expression of present emotion or personal intention. It is a juridic act through which a man and a woman establish a permanent communion of life. Within this framework, freedom is understood as capable of binding itself definitively through self-gift. Unity, fidelity, and indissolubility are therefore not external rules imposed by the Church. They belong to the very structure of marriage itself. The magisterial tradition examined throughout the study emphasizes this point repeatedly. John Paul II already insists that marriage law reflects an objective truth about the human person and about the nature of conjugal commitment. Benedict XVI likewise warns against reducing matrimonial consent to emotional sincerity or later relational success. In both cases, the concern is the same. Marriage cannot be reconstructed retrospectively according to changing emotional or sociological criteria without altering the object of consent itself. Many contemporary approaches to relationships, however, often understand freedom differently. Commitment is frequently approached more cautiously and more conditionally. Reversibility, personal self-protection, emotional authenticity, and the preservation of future possibilities often become central concerns. Commitment may be still desired sincerely, but it is frequently understood as something that should remain open to later revision if circumstances, emotions, or personal fulfillment change. The magisterial tradition does not interpret this situation primarily as a moral rebellion or hostility toward church. The problem is deeper and more structural. It concerns formation. Many young couples today are formed within cultural conditions that do not always prepare persons for understanding freedom as a definitive and lasting self-commitment. For this reason, the question is fundamentally a problem of reception. The Church's doctrine on marriage remains coherent. Canon law itself likewise remains coherent. The difficulty lies increasingly in the reception of this understanding of marriage within contemporary cultural conditions. The papal allocutions examined in this study therefore reject two opposite errors. The first is reducing canon law to a rigid technical system detached from concrete human reality. The second is weakening juridic truth in the name of pastoral accommodation or sociological realism. Both approaches ultimately fail because they separate the objective structure of marriage from the concrete human person who must assume that structure through consent. The notion of antinomy, therefore, allows us to identify the present difficulty more precisely. The issue is not simply tradition versus modernity. Rather, it is the growing tension between the canonical understanding of definitive consent and the formative conditions through which many young couples today learn to understand freedom, permanence, and personal responsibility. The antinomy described thus far becomes visible concretely in contemporary patterns of relationships and commitment. These developments must be approached carefully and without simplistic condemnations. The magisterial and jurisprudential sources examined do not interpret the present situation merely as evidence of moral decline, or even the rejection of Christian marriage. In many cases, the reality is more complex. Many young couples, as I mentioned, still desire permanence, fidelity, emotional intimacy, and stable relationships. The desire for lasting love has not disappeared. Yet, at the same time, many hesitate before irrevocable juridic commitment. This hesitation appears repeatedly in contemporary relationship patterns and helps explain why sacramental marriage is often postponed, avoided, or even replaced by more provisional forms of union. One of the clearest examples is the normalization of cohabitation. In many cultural contexts, cohabitation is no longer viewed as exceptional or temporary. It is often understood as a normal stage within the development of relationship. Importantly, many couples do not enter such relationships because they reject marriage entirely. Rather, cohabitation is frequently presented as a way of testing compatibility, reducing risk, or delaying a commitment perceived as too final or too difficult to reverse. The magisterial text examined already recognized this phenomenon decades ago. Familiaris Consortio, for example, does not treat cohabitation simply as an isolated moral failure. Instead, it situates it within the broader cultural and social conditions, including fear of irreversibility, economic uncertainty, distrust of institutions, and insufficient personal formation for permanent commitment. Later magisterial teaching continues this approach by emphasizing that many couples experience definitive commitment not as liberating, but as risky and potentially overwhelming. This helps explain the relationship between emotional authenticity and juridic commitment. In many contemporary approaches to relationships, authenticity is closely connected to emotional sincerity and personal experience. Commitment is often understood as valid only so long as emotional fulfillment or relational satisfaction continues. As a result, permanence may appear dangerous because it seems to remove the possibility of future revision. Within this framework, reversibility can begin to function almost as a condition of personal freedom. Relationships remain meaningful, but they remain intentionally open to reconsideration if circumstances change. This does not necessarily mean that young couples are incapable of generosity or sacrifice. Rather, it reflects a different understanding of how commitment develops over time. The same dynamic can also be seen in the postponement of marriage. Many couples delay sacramental marriage for years, even while maintaining stable and while remain in stable and serious relationships. Frequently, the reasons given are recurring and familiar: uncertainty about readiness, fear of failure, financial instability, professional insecurity, or the feeling that one must first achieve a certain level of emotional or personal certainty before entering a permanent union. Magisterial teaching does not dismiss these concerns as irrational. Economic instability, social fragmentation, and changing cultural expectations are treated as real factors that influence how young adults approach commitment. The problem, therefore, is not simply moral weakness. The problem concerns the gradual formation of persons within cultural conditions that often make definitive commitment appear difficult to sustain. Distrust of institutions also plays an important role. Many young adults continue to value personal relationships while approaching institutions more cautiously, including ecclesial institutions. Marriage may therefore be understood increasingly as a private emotional relationship, rather than as a public and ecclesial act that establishes a stable juridic state of life. In this context, the juridic form of marriage can appear external, burdensome, or unnecessary, even when the relationship itself is experienced as sincere and meaningful. For canon law, these developments are highly significant because they affect the way matrimonial consent itself is understood. Canonical marriage presupposes that freedom is capable of expressing itself through a definitive and public act of self-commitment. Yet many contemporary relationship patterns approach commitment more gradually, conditionally, and provisionally. The magisterial tradition does not respond to these developments by redefining marriage itself. The Church does not conclude that permanence, fidelity, or indissolubility have become unrealistic. At the same time, the sources examined in this study repeatedly insist that these contemporary difficulties must be understood seriously and pastorally. The growing distance between the canonical understanding of marriage and contemporary patterns of formation cannot be ignored simply by repeating juridic norms abstractly. The antinomy therefore becomes visible not only at the level of theory, but within the lived experience of many young couples themselves. The desire for love, stability, fidelity, and permanence often remains present, yet these same couples frequently hesitate before the definitive juridic act through which a canonical marriage comes into existence. In order to understand why the contemporary tension surrounding marriage becomes canonically significant, it is necessary to examine more closely how canon law understands matrimonial consent itself. At this point, the discussion moves from sociological and cultural level to the juridic and anthropological level. Canon law approaches marriage not simply as an emotional relationship, nor merely as a process of gradual interpersonal development. Marriage is understood as a definitive vocation brought into existence through consent. The marital bond arises through the human act by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept one another in order to establish a permanent communion of life. Consent is therefore not secondary to marriage. It is constitutive of marriage itself. This explains why canon law places such emphasis upon the moment of consent. Matrimonial consent is not simply the expression of present affection or emotional sincerity. It is a juridic act through which the parties establish a new and permanent state of life within both the church and society. Marriage therefore possesses a public and ecclesial character from the beginning. It is not understood as a purely private arrangement that acquires juridic recognition only afterward. Canon law therefore does not impose arbitrary obligations externally upon marriage. Rather, it juridically expresses what marriage is: unity, fidelity, permanence, and indissolubility are not later additions imposed by ecclesiastical authority. They belong to the object of matrimonial consent itself. The juridic structure of marriage reflects the Church's understanding of the nature of conjugal commitment. This understanding also explains why freedom occupies such a central place within matrimonial jurisprudence. The tradition examined throughout this study understands freedom not simply as the ability to preserve future options, but as the capacity to give oneself definitively through a stable act of commitment. Matrimonial consent therefore presupposes what several papal allocutions describe as an integrated exercise of the intellect and will. The person must possess sufficient judgment concerning marriage and sufficient internal freedom to undertake the obligations that marriage involve. At this point, an important distinction emerges repeatedly within papal teaching and rodal jurisprudence: the distinction between incapacity and difficulty. This distinction is central to the canonical analysis developed in this study. John Paul II and Benedict XVI repeatedly warn against confusing contemporary cultural difficulties with a true incapacity to marry. Modern social conditions, emotional immaturity, fear of commitment, or widespread relational instability may make marriage more difficult to undertake and sustain. Yet difficulty alone does not invalidate consent. Canon law continues to presume the ordinary capacity of persons to marry. This presumption is important because the Church does not begin from the assumption that modern persons are generally incapable of definitive commitment. Such a conclusion would ultimately undermine both Christian anthropology and the juridic coherence of marriage itself. Instead, incapacity under Canon 1095 concerns situations in which the person lacks the ability to place a valid act of consent proportionate to the object of marriage. The papal allocutions examined strongly insist upon this point. Already John Paul II repeatedly cautions judges against allowing cultural pessimism or sociological trends to distort juridic evaluation. Benedict XVI likewise warns against interpreting marital failure retrospectively as a proof that valid consent was absent from the very beginning. This warning against retrospective logic is especially important today. Within many contemporary discussions, there is a tendency to evaluate the validity of marriage primarily through the later success or failure of the relationship. Yet canonical jurisprudence consistently rejects this approach. A failed marriage does not by itself prove incapacity or even a defective consent, just as a long-lasting marriage does not automatically prove that valid consent was present. The juridic question concerns the moment consent is exchanged. The task is to determine whether the parties possess the capacity to undertake marriage and whether they truly intended what marriage is, according to its objective nature. For this reason, matrimonial jurisprudence resists reducing validity to emotional intensity, relational satisfaction, or later psychological compatibility. The distinction between incapacity and unwillingness likewise remains essential. A person may resist commitment, fear permanence, or approach marriage with immaturity, yet still possesses sufficient capacity to marry validly. Canon law does not require perfect emotional development or a complete psychological maturity before marriage can exist. Marriage is not reserved to persons who have already achieved complete personal integration. Rather, marriage is itself understood as a vocation, within which growth, sacrifice, and maturation continue over time. The objective structure of marriage therefore remains decisive throughout the canonical tradition. Marriage presupposes permanence, fidelity, and definitive self-commitment, because these belong to the nature of marital bond itself. At the same time, the Church recognizes that many contemporary cultural conditions make this understanding of freedom and commitment more difficult to receive and to live concretely. This is precisely why the present tension cannot be resolved simply by lowering juridic expectations or even redefining the object of consent. If the juridic structure of marriage were adjusted entirely to contemporary patterns of provisional commitment, marriage itself would gradually lose its definitive and public character. The deeper question is therefore whether contemporary formation adequately prepares person for the kind of freedom that matrimonial consent presupposes. Seen in this light, matrimonial jurisprudence does not function primarily as a mechanism for adapting doctrine to changing social realities. Rather, it seeks to safeguard both the truth of marriage and the dignity of the human person by evaluating carefully whether a true act of matrimonial consent was possible in a concrete case. At the center of the study lies a more specific tension concerning the meaning of permanence itself. The question is no longer simply whether marriage remains valued socially or emotionally. Rather, the deeper issue concerns whether freedom is understood as capable of making an irrevocable and definitive act of self-commitment. From the perspective of canon law, marriage presupposes precisely this kind of freedom. Matrimonial consent establishes a permanent bond because the parties mutually give and accept one another through an act directed toward an enduring communion of life. Permanence is therefore not understood as something added externally after consent. It belongs to the very structure of marital act itself. For this reason, the canonical tradition consistently understands freedom and definitiveness as compatible with one another. Freedom reaches one of its highest expressions precisely in the capacity to bind oneself through a lasting act of self-gift. Matrimonial consent is therefore not viewed as a limitation upon freedom, but as an exercise of freedom in its fullest personal and juridic form. The contemporary cultural situation often approaches this question differently. In many contexts, reversibility increasingly appears necessary for preserving personal authenticity and autonomy. Commitment may still be desired sincerely, but it is often approached with the assumption that it should remain open to future reconsiderations if circumstances, emotions, or even personal needs change. This helps explain why many young adults do not reject marriage directly, yet continue to hesitate before definitive commitment. The difficulty frequently concerns permanence itself. Irrevocable commitment can appear risky because contemporary cultural conditions often encourage persons to preserve flexibility and openness rather than bind themselves permanently with a stable juridic state of life. The study does not interpret the situation primarily as a moral failure. The issue is more structural. Many persons are formed within social and cultural environments that approach identity, relationships, work, and personal development in increasingly provisional ways. Long-term commitments often appear difficult, not because commitment is despised, but because reversibility has become closely associated with personal security and authenticity. The magisterial tradition recognizes this difficulty repeatedly. Already John Paul II identifies fear of definitiveness as one of the characteristic difficulties affecting contemporary approaches to marriage and freedom. Benedict XVI likewise warns that many modern understandings of freedom struggle to view permanent commitment as compatible with authentic self-realization. The concern in these texts is not merely moral permissiveness. Rather, it is the weakening of the very idea that freedom can fulfill itself through irrevocable self-gift. At this point, the antinomy becomes particularly visible. Canonical marriage presupposes freedom, capable of definitive and lasting self-commitment. Contemporary culture, however, often approaches reversibility as a condition for preserving authenticity and personal autonomy. The tension, therefore, concerns two different ways of understanding both freedom and permanence. This distinction helps explain why many contemporary difficulties surrounding marriage cannot be resolved simply through stronger moral exhortation or even stricter juridic language. The issue concerns the deeper anthropological and formative conditions through which persons come to understand commitment itself. For this reason, the Church's magisterial teaching consistently resists two inadequate responses. The first would be to conclude that permanence has become unrealistic and therefore should be weakened juridically or pastorally. The second would be to interpret every hesitation toward permanence simply as bad faith or refusal of responsibility. The sources examined in this study reject both conclusions. Instead, the magisterial and jurisprudential tradition continues to affirm that marriage remains a definitive vocation grounded in irrevocable consent, while simultaneously recognizing that many young couples today approach commitment within cultural conditions that no longer consistently support this understanding of freedom. The tension becomes specifically important at the moment matrimonial consent is exchanged. Canon law must ask whether the person is capable of undertaking a definitive act proportionate to the object of marriage. Yet the law cannot simply redefine marriage whenever contemporary patterns of commitment become more provisional or unstable. Otherwise, the object of matrimonial consent itself would gradually change. Seen in the slide, the antinomy identified throughout this study is neither a purely moral problem nor simply a sociological observation. It concerns the meeting of two different understandings of freedom at the moment consent is given. One understands freedom as capable of definitive self-binding. The other tends to preserve freedom through ongoing reversibility and openness to revision. This is why the present tension surrounding marriage is ultimately so significant canonically. The issue concerns not only how young couples behave, but how permanence, commitment, and freedom themselves are increasingly understood within contemporary culture. If the present tension surrounding marriage concerns the relationship between canonical consent and contemporary formation and freedom, an important question immediately follows. How should the Church respond pastorally and juridically to this situation? The magisterial and jurisprudential sources consistently reject two inadequate responses. The first would be to weaken the object of marriage itself in order to simply accommodate contemporary difficulties surrounding permanence and commitment. The second would be to treat juridic norms as though they alone could resolve problems that originate much earlier within the formation of persons and relationships. The present study therefore argues that the issue cannot be addressed adequately either through simple doctrinal repetition or through juridic adaptation detached from anthropology and pastoral formation. The problem concerns mediation. More specifically, it concerns the Church's institutional responsibility to mediate coherently between the objective structure of marriage and the concrete persons who must assume it through consent. This mediating responsibility belongs to the Church at multiple levels. It involves pastoral accompaniment, catechesis, affective and moral formation, marriage preparation, ecclesial support, and juridic discernment. These dimensions cannot be separated from one another without creating further confusion. For this reason, the magisterial tradition repeatedly insists that accompaniment cannot be reduced to norm reduction. Amoris Laetitia, in particular, emphasizes discernment and pastoral accompaniment, but without redefining the object of marriage itself. The exhortation consistently rejects both rigid formalism and relativistic reinterpretation of doctrine. Discernment, therefore, does not create new juridic criteria for marriage, nor does it authorize the gradual weakening of permanence, fidelity, or indissolubility. The distinction between the pastoral and juridic forums is therefore essential. Pastoral accompaniment seeks to help persons move forward toward truth and maturity. Juridical activity, however, must determine whether valid matrimonial consent was truly possible and actually exchanged in a concrete case. When these distinct functions become confused, pastoral concern risks becoming a substitute for juridic analysis, while juridic judgment risks being transformed into a form of discretionary pastoral accommodation. At this point, the role of ecclesiastical tribunals becomes particularly important. The papal allocutions repeatedly emphasize that tribunals cannot resolve broader failures of formation through expensive interpretations of incapacity or of consent. The tribunal does not exist to compensate for inadequate catechesis, weak pastoral preparation, cultural inability, or the emotional fragility of contemporary society. Its task remains more precise and more limited: to determine whether a valid matrimonial bond was brought into existence according to the objective criteria of canon law. The study therefore stresses repeatedly that the law itself does not create the present tension surrounding marriage. Rather, the law reveals it. Canon law makes visible a deeper problem already present within cultural and formative conditions through which many young couples approach commitment, permanence, and freedom. This point is essential because canon law is often criticized as though the juridic structure of marriage itself were the source of contemporary difficulties. Yet the magisterial tradition examined consistently argues the opposite. The juridic norms does not arbitrarily impose unrealistic expectations upon human relationships. Rather, it expresses the objective structure of marriage as understood within the Christian and canonical tradition. The deeper question therefore concerns formation before consent is exchanged. If young adults are formed within cultural conditions that increasingly approach relationships provisionally and reversibly, then the Church cannot rely solely on juridic procedures after marital breakdown has already occurred. Formation before marriage becomes decisive. This is why already Familiaris Consortio repeatedly emphasizes long-term formation in freedom, responsibility, and Christian understanding of marriage. Marriage preparation is not presented merely as a short instructional program before the wedding ceremony. It is understood as part of a broader ecclesial process through which persons gradually learn the meaning of self-gift, permanence, fidelity, sacrifice, and stable commitment. The same concern appears in later magisterial teaching. The issue is not simply whether couples understand doctrinal propositions intellectually. The deeper issue concerns whether persons are formed concretely for the kind of freedom that marriage presupposes. Without such formation, marriage may continue to appear meaningful in principle while remaining difficult to undertake in practice. Seen in this light, the present study does not conclude by proposing doctrinal change or even a juridic reduction, nor does it advocate a merely defensive reaffirmation of norms detached from pastoral reality. Rather, it points toward a renewed integration of pastoral formation, ecclesial mediation, and juridic discernment. The challenge facing the Church is therefore not to redefine marriage according to contemporary instability, but to strengthen the ecclesial and formative structures through which the intelligibility of definitive commitment can once again be communicated, received, and lived concretely by young couples. In conclusion, the analysis presented throughout this study suggests that contemporary hesitation towards sacramental marriage among many young couples cannot be explained adequately simply through categories such as moral decline, doctrinal dissent, or even juridic rigidity. The situation is more complex and more deeply connected to the way freedom, commitment, and permanence are increasingly understood within contemporary culture. Many young couples continue to desire love, fidelity, emotional intimacy, and lasting relationships. Yet at the same time, definitive commitment often appears difficult to undertake concretely. The tension examined throughout this presentation therefore concerns more than changing social behavior. It concerns the growing distance between the canonical understanding of marriage and the formative conditions through which many persons today learn to approach commitment and personal responsibility. For this reason, The notion of antinomy has been proposed as a useful analytic category. The issue is not simply a conflict between doctrine and culture, nor between canon law and lived experience. Rather, the tension emerges between two different understandings of freedom and permanence. Canonical marriage presupposes freedom capable of definitive and irrevocable self-gift. Contemporary culture, however, often approaches reversibility as necessary for preserving personal authenticity and autonomy. The magisterial and jurisprudential tradition examined consistently resists responding to the situation, either by weakening the object of marriage or by reducing pastoral care to juridic formalism. The Church does not conclude that permanence, fidelity, and indissolubility have become unrealistic. At the same time, the sources repeatedly acknowledge that many contemporary cultural conditions make this understanding of marriage more difficult to receive, understand, and live concretely. The present crisis, therefore, concerns reception, formation, and the exercise of freedom more than the incoherence of marriage doctrine itself. The deeper problem is not that the Church continues to teach the definitive marriage, but that many persons are no longer formed consistently for the kind of freedom that such consent presupposes. Seen in this light, the Church's challenge is not simply to repeat doctrine more forcefully, nor to redefine marriage according to contemporary instability. Rather, the challenge is to restore the intelligibility of definitive commitment within contemporary culture. This requires renewed attention to formation, accompaniment, ecclesial mediation, and the anthropological foundations upon which matrimonial consent depends. Only within such a framework can the Church continue to propose marriage convincingly as both true and humanly livable, while preserving its juridic and sacramental integrity. Thank you very much.